And recording in progress. So we're good. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you for joining me. I am Georgia Fruitinick. And for the last 6 years, I was the parent mentor for Coweta County Schools, which meant I support parents who have children with disabilities, whether they're diagnosed or not, and help them navigate. Sometimes it's the IEP system, sometimes it's helping get funding like Medicaid and Katie Beckett, that type thing. Really kind of whatever comes up. I've been doing this work for almost 20 years, which I find kind of unbelievable. My son Augie, who you'll hear some about today, was diagnosed with autism when he was 2, and the prognosis wasn't good. They said it was doubtful that he would function in mainstream society. And I will report to you that today he is at Middle Tennessee State University. He's a freshman in college. And he is living in the dorm, and he has a roommate, and he is doing quite well in mainstream society. So I really have learned. I started this presentation several years ago in a webinar training that I did for Parent to Parent of Georgia, which is a nonprofit that supports families who have children with disabilities. I worked for them for about 10 years, and I've learned so much since the first time I did this training. So I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you today. It's definitely a relevant topic in my life since I have a freshman in college, and I'm, I wouldn't even say I'm knee deep in it. I would say I'm more like, neck deep in it. So let's get started. And I will tell you that I'm no longer the parent mentor. My family moved to Nashville, Tennessee this summer. And really the reason we moved was to support Augie. In addition to having autism, he has some chronic health issues, and he just wasn't healthy enough to be 5 hours away. And he wanted to get a degree in audio engineering. And it really started out as a joke between me and my husband. We were like, maybe we should just go with him and we'll just go to Nashville. And it started out as a joke, and then it became reality. We actually ended up moving, and it's been really nice to be. We're about 45 minutes away, so we can get him on the weekends, and we can help him with laundry, and we can help him do some of the things that are hard to do with his fatigue levels. So I will tell you that I miss you all terribly, and I'm hoping to be back someday. But I'm also really blessed to be able to given the opportunity from Coweta Schools to just kind of plug in and have some conversations by doing some training and a little bit of contract work. Okay, so let's get started. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the differences between high school and college. We're going to talk about the process of requesting and getting accommodations in college. And then we're going to talk about how do you prepare your students to advocate for themselves. One of the mistakes, in my opinion, that we as parents make sometimes is not preparing them early enough, not starting early enough. And I think sometimes when we protect them, which is what we want to do with every ounce of our being, we don't necessarily prepare them. And so wherever you are in this journey, I encourage you not to beat yourself up, because it's real easy for us to do, right? Because we feel like, well, I should be doing this better, and we should on ourselves a lot. So throw out the word should from your vocabulary, and don't should on yourself. However, wherever you are right now is where you are right now. And so focus on, we're right here, and we're going to just go forward. So I'm hoping to give you some tools to be able to do that. But whatever you do, don't leave here feeling real discouraged because you haven't done enough. You have done your very best, which is all you can do. And now that you know more, you can do more, maybe. We'll see. Okay, so the big differences, there's a bunch of differences between high school and college, in addition to the obvious ones. But as far as special education and what your rights are, there's a couple of big differences. One is what your legal rights are. In high school, you have the right to a free, appropriate public education. You'll hear it called FAPE. In college, it's not free. There's no public education in college that you have the right to. You have to pay to go to college or get student loans or scholarships or whatever, and there's no legal right to a college education. And so that's a big one. Who attends? Anybody, regardless of their disability, can attend a public high school. Public school has to take every single person and do the best they can with every single person. Well, in college, you got to meet the admissions criteria. Okay, so as you're starting to look at colleges for your child, or if you're supporting parents in this process, it's real important that you know what that admissions criteria is based on the colleges. And then it really varies widely. Some people think, well, if I get a high school diploma, then therefore I'm going to have what I need to be able to get into colleges. And it's not necessarily true, because different colleges have different admissions criteria. One of the colleges that Augie was applying to required 3 years of foreign language. Well, a lot of the 4-year schools ask for 2 years of foreign language. A lot of 4-year schools require 4 years of math. Well, some of the 2-year schools only make you have 2 years of math. And so it's important to kind of do some research and ask those questions. And it's typically on their websites, and do a little research on what but the bottom line is you got to be able to get in. Okay. So in high school, there are 2 big laws that kind of protect and help children with disabilities. The first is called the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Okay, that's a big word. That's why we call it the IDEA. And that is an education act that provides the funding for special education. Okay, so it's a federal law, and every state has to take that federal law and then figure out how they're going to implement it. Okay, so that's the funding for, if you have a child with an IEP, that's the funding for the IEP. And the funding is based on the amount of services. Well, we could talk a whole day about that, which we won't, because I don't know enough about it. It's based on the services that are in those IEPs. Okay. And then the other one, you'll hear people say, maybe they have an IEP, or maybe they have a 504 plan. And people ask me a lot of times, which is better, an IEP or a 504 plan? There's no right or wrong. One is not necessarily better than the other. They're 2 different things. The 504 is actually a section of a law. It's section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Okay, and it falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is not an education law. It's actually a civil rights law. And that law says that you can't discriminate against someone because they have a disability. It was passed in 1990, so it really wasn't that long ago. In my mind, it wasn't that long ago. And it gave people with disabilities a lot of rights. And we're going to talk about some of those in a minute. And so it's different than the IEP, because it doesn't have, the IEP has specialized instruction, where the 504 simply has accommodations. So in college, the IDEA goes away. At age 22, basically your rights stop under the IDEA when a child graduates from high school or they turn 22. Some kids stay in school longer, and some kids then when they're 18. And a lot of times those kids are on what's called a GAA, which is an alternative assessment track. And so that's not really the kids that I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about the kids who are going through high school. They still may take a little longer, but they're getting a general education diploma. So when they get to college, the IDEA goes away, and your rights fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's basically discrimination. You have the right to not be discriminated. The type of support is real different in high school and college. In high school, you have either an IEP or a 504 plan. If you have an IEP, you have specialized instruction, you have goals, and there's lots of data that's being collected on those goals. In college, you don't have goals. Basically, you get accommodations to level the playing field. It's all about getting access to the education, okay? So nobody's collecting data. The colleges don't, I don't want to say they don't care, because they do care. They don't really have an opinion on whether a student takes advantage of their accommodations or not. They want to encourage students to do that, but the professors are not going to chase students down and offer them accommodations. And that's where we get to the last one. Who initiates the request? It has to come from the students. In high school, parents request meetings, teachers request meetings, students can request meetings. It doesn't happen as often, but parents and teachers typically see kids who are struggling and they say, hey, we need to get together and talk about how to support this kid. That doesn't happen in college. If a student needs accommodations, then the student's going to be the one that has to ask for it. So it's really, you can see where that self-advocacy becomes important, because it's real important for students to understand what they've got going on and understand what they need for help. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk about more of that in a minute. Don't panic on me. We're okay. I wanted to give you a couple of visuals on what I mean by having access. And you see the one on the bottom right. You've got the kid who's in the wheelchair and he's at the bottom of the stairs. Okay. Before the Americans with Disabilities Act, there was no duty for buildings, what public buildings or private buildings, to have access for people in wheelchairs. Okay, so you can see that that kid doesn't have access to that building, right? Well, nowadays we know we have ramps, we have elevators, we have all these things, but when this picture was taken, perhaps they didn't have those things. And that's one of the gifts of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I think if you're talking about, you know, a kid in a wheelchair, or maybe someone who has more of an obvious disability, access is more obvious. If you have someone with a visual impairment, they may need Braille, or someone may need sign language who has some hearing loss. But with the invisible disabilities, it's not as clear. And so an example of an invisible disability could be a kid with dyslexia or a kid with ADHD. And so for a kid with dyslexia who has a difficult time coding and reading and processing what she's reading, access to an education for her may mean extra time on a test. It's taking her a little longer to process, and so she's going to need some extra time to get her test done. It doesn't mean that she gets special treatment. It means that we're trying to level the playing field. And that's sometimes hard for people to understand that aren't immersed in this field. And so I encourage you to talk to your kids about that. Talk to them about the difference. I mean, you see this equity versus equality visual a lot too. And I think I sent it out to my email list last year. And so everybody wants to watch the game, right? And so everybody gets a stool to watch the game. Well, you can see that the little kid can't see the game. He doesn't have access to the game. And so, but when we give him a couple of stools, he can see the game. He has access to the game. And the dad, maybe on the far left, he doesn't need any of the stools. So he doesn't get the access. So when we treat everyone equally, we don't necessarily treat them equitably. And so that's kind of that discussion. And so I think sometimes it's hard for kids to take advantage of their rights and their accommodations because they don't really understand what they mean. And a lot of times they don't understand, some kids don't even know they have a disability. And some parents choose to call it something else, which is totally their choice, but the law calls it a disability. And so if you call it a superpower at your house, that's perfectly fine. But if they want to go to college and they want to take advantage, or in the workplace, and they want to take advantage of the rights that they have under the law, then they can't be afraid of the word disability. And so I'm going to encourage you to kind of neutralize the word disability. It's not a bad word. And a lot of parents ask me, when is the appropriate time to talk to my kid? And I think as soon as you find out, maybe even before you find out, as you're trying to figure out what's going on, just keep open communication, because I think sometimes when we don't tell our kids what's going on, the message that we're telling them is that something's wrong with them. And there's nothing wrong with them, because having a disability is completely natural. It's a natural part of the human experience. Any one of us, I see a list of people on the call, any one of us can become, a lot of us already are part of this community. But any one of us can become a part of this community in a moment, in an eyelash, in a moment's notice. And then sometimes you've seen this for fare selection, everybody has to take the same exam, and then you've got the fish that you're asking to climb the tree. Well, that's not necessarily fair, right? Okay, so I like to have some visuals with that. So I just want to share those with you. And really the whole point is that accommodations are all about access. It's not about special treatment. It's about leveling. Another term you'll hear is leveling the playing field. Okay, so I didn't load the polls into Zoom, but I'm going to ask you this question and I want you to answer it in your brain, and then we'll talk about the answer. Okay, so true or false, a college student with autism spectrum disorder can have an IEP that is similar to what she had in college. All right, so what do y'all think? Is that true or is that false? Okay, it's false. There's no IEPs in college. So that's important for you to know. You don't take your IEP to college. And parents a lot of times are shocked by that, but that's the reality, because the IEP is underneath the IDEA, remember? And the IDEA goes away. Okay, so let's shift and talk a little bit about requesting and receiving accommodations. You got to meet, we've already talked about, you got to meet the admissions requirements. So I encourage you to take a look at what the admissions requirements are. And the earlier, the better. I know a lot of kids just don't know where they want to go to school or what they want to study or anything like that. And I think that's okay. I think sometimes we push kids to know too early these days. But you got to meet the admissions requirements. You can get accommodations on the ACT, the SAT, the PSAT, AP test. You can get accommodations on all of those, what they call high stakes testing. So if your kid wanted to become a nurse, they could get accommodations on that licensing test that they do. I went to law school. If I had it to do now, I would probably request accommodations on the LSAT. You can get accommodations on all of those high stakes tests, but it's not something, the school counselors can help you do that for sure, but it's not something that automatically happens through the school. Even though you may take the ACT and the SAT at the school, the governing bodies that govern those tests aren't affiliated with the school. And so if you want accommodations on the ACT or the SAT or any of those tests, you have to apply for them through the College Board. And your counselor can give you the information. The school counselors can give you information. Your case managers can probably do that too, on how to do that. And I want you to be sure to do that early because it takes a little time to process that. So I'll give you an example. Augie, because of his chronic illness, got accommodations on the ACT. He got, I think it was time and a half. And so he got the regular time and then he got half as much time. And that helped him because he needed to take breaks and it was exhausting. And so he was also able to take it in a small group. Now, if you had a child who had severe anxiety, maybe that small group would be what they need, but maybe they wouldn't need extra time. And so the accommodations are really just based on what the kid needs. Also, in the admissions process, you have to choose whether you're going to disclose or not disclose whether you have a disability. They cannot discriminate. So they can't exclude you if you meet all of the admissions requirements just because you have a disability. Now, they can say you don't get in because your scores or your whatever is not as good as other kids, but they can't do it just because you have a disability. And some kids choose not to disclose that they have a disability, and that's totally their personal choice. Augie chose to disclose it because he wrote his college essay on having Lyme disease and the journey that he's been through on being on hospital homebound and a lot of the stuff that happened with his Lyme disease. But that's totally a personal choice. And so it's something, you don't have to do it in the admissions process, but it's something to just kind of think through and talk about it and talk about kind of the pros and the cons. And In my mind, that's a student's choice. It's not a parent's choice. You see an important shift that's going on here from being parent-led to being student-led. Okay. One thing I forgot to say is that if you've got questions that are coming up, go ahead and type them in the chat. And if I've got, as they're coming up, if I've got some time at the end, then I can answer some of those questions. I've got Beverly logged on from central office, and she's kind of helping to document some of those questions. And if I don't end up having time to answer those questions, then I'll send out an email. I've got everybody's email that registered. If you got the link from someone, if you didn't register and you just got the link from someone else, then shoot me an email so I have your email address. And okay, so hold on one second, I gotta get this thing out of the way. Okay, so still talking about requesting and receiving accommodations in college. It's totally voluntary. Students don't have to do it. What I find in my support of parents in the last, almost 20 years is that a lot of kids choose not to go through the process of getting accommodations in college. Some kids, they're tired of having an IEP. They're tired of getting special help. Some parents think, well, they shouldn't need it now because they're 18. And so there's a lot of reasons why a student would choose not to, and it's a personal choice whether they do or not. I also find that sometimes parents come to me, and some students have come to me also and said, I wish I would have applied for accommodations. I needed them. I didn't ask for them, and now it's too late to get them. You can apply for them at any time, but they're not retroactive. So if you go through first semester and you don't apply for them, and then you apply for them second semester, you can have them for second semester. They don't apply to what went on first semester. Every college is going to have an Office of Disability Services. I wish they would all call it the same thing, but the reality is they don't. They all call it something different. And so it could be the Office of Accessible Services. It could be disability. I mean, could be lots of different words, but every college has an Office of Disability Services, and a lot of them have different, especially after COVID, have different requirements for what the documentation. Some colleges will take your IEP and take a look at it and help you figure out what the accommodations would be based on that. Other colleges don't want to see that IEP. They only want to see the psychological evaluation. I will tell you that most colleges, that from my experience, want the psychological evaluation to be within 3 years. So if you're coming up through middle school and you had a psych eval, maybe with the school system in like 7th grade, and sometimes the school system doesn't do another evaluation because they know the child qualifies, and they get a lot of information by teaching the child and by looking at the goals and tweaking things, so they don't feel like a full evaluation is really that helpful. And so a lot of times they'll have eligibility meetings and they'll go, yeah, we still feel like he's eligible, and they'll keep going, but they didn't do that full psychological. And so as a parent, you can request to have another a comprehensive evaluation done when you're at that reevaluation time that kind of comes up every 3 years. And so it's something to talk about with your team, because what I find is that if you need the evaluation to be updated, you can get it updated through the school system, but it's just, don't wait until spring semester of your senior year to do it, because it's going to take a minute. So I encourage you to know what the documentation requirements are. Okay, so I've already said that the student initiates the request and will submit the documentation of disability. Most of them have kind of like an online portal that you do that. You create an account and then you upload your documents. And so it's not a difficult process. After you create an account, you upload the documentation, the disability services folks will reach out and they'll schedule a meeting. And you can attend the meeting. The parents can attend to the meeting as long as the student gives you permission, because once they're 18, they're adults and they can exclude you from this process if they want to. But what I find is most kids want the help. And my kids certainly did. And so for Augie, what we did is when we narrowed it down, he wanted to get a degree in audio engineering. Okay, so if you want a degree in audio engineering, you have to go to New York, California, Miami, or Nashville. And so of all those places, Nashville was really the, you know, his where he wanted to go. And he looked at two, Belmont University and MTSU, Middle Tennessee State University, both have really good audio engineering programs. And so that's how he said, okay, I want to get a degree in audio engineering. So he applied to some schools. He got into both schools. So that was very cool. And then we scheduled meetings with both disability services offices. And we met with them on the same day. And we met with them via Zoom. And Augie, we prepared ahead of time. We prepared questions to ask and all of that things. And Augie went through and talked about some of his accommodations that he would need. And we talked to both. And then after we got off the phone, it was so hard for me to be quiet because I didn't ask a bunch of questions. It was really hard. And I let him lead. I tried my best. And but after we got off the phone, he looked at me, he said, I think I need to go to MTSU, don't I? And I was like, I think so, because I think maybe being a state school, Belmont's a great school, but it's a small private school. And so whenever he was asking them about accommodations, you have to read body language. They were doing things like, we'll have to think about that. Yeah, we could probably do that. We'll have to check. I need to check with somebody on that. They were doing a lot of kind of qualifying, where the meeting with MTSU was, oh yeah, we can do that. And does he need this? And does he need this? And we have this program. And they were just like overwhelmed with all of the information that they were giving us. And so as you're going through this process, it's important to ask questions, because not every college, they're not all treated equally. They all have a disability services office, but they're not all, doing as well as the other ones. So I encourage you to ask questions and read body language and find out what people, have to say about that. Okay. So the next step, after the student initiates the request, submits the documentation, then there'll be a meeting with the disability services people. It's important that you understand that the accommodations have to be reasonable. Okay, hold on, yeah. And they can deny your request for accommodations. And the accommodations are totally based on what the kid needs. Not every kid needs, like some kids only need a few accommodations and other kids need a whole lot of it. I mean, I can't give you a list of all the accommodations. You could probably Google and find, some samples, but I encourage you to really kind of pare it down to really what they need, and don't ask for 1,000 accommodations, because it just gets too complicated. And a lot of times they don't need that much. Figure out what are the things, what is the disability, how does it affect education, and really what are the accommodations that are needed. So the next step in the process is, after the meeting with the Disability Services Office, they'll give you a letter. Some people call it a student accommodation letter. People call it different things. Here are some examples that just kind of came to mind as I was working on the presentation of things that could be accommodations in college. Maybe extra time on quizzes, tests, and exams, tests taken in a small group or a distraction-free environment, maybe assistive technology equipment. If someone has a hearing, a mobility, or a visual impairment, they have different formats for textbooks, permission to record lectures, get copies of notes, that type thing. And then you'll find that academic accommodations are treated differently than housing accommodations. And so maybe you need a room your kid needs a room on the first floor because of their disability. Maybe if you have a child that maybe needs assistance, if there's an emergency situation. I mean, it's really, the examples are endless, but those give you some examples. And so what'll happen is, after you get this accommodation letter, hold on. The next step is for the students to communicate with the professors. And different colleges handle it different ways. Augie's actually he can log into a system. He has like an account with the disability services folks, and he just clicks on check boxes. that says, I want these are the classes that I'm taking, and I want these accommodations sent to these professors. So if he chose to, he wouldn't have to share all of his accommodations with all of his professors. He could say, well, I don't think that's a math class and I'm really good at math, so maybe I don't need extra time on the test in math. And so that system gives him the chance to kind of customize it with his professors. Now, I feel strongly that communication with professors is really important. And so I wouldn't say I required Augie to send an email to his professors, because he certainly could have said no. But from day one, and I did this even in high school, that we would sit down, and we started doing it together, and then he started doing it more independently. We would sit down and write an email to the professors, because sometimes the information that they get from the Disability Services Office is vague. Like it may say chronic fatigue, and then these are the accommodations. Well, it doesn't really tell them much about Augie and his journey and all that. And so I think it's a good idea to start a relationship with the professor. Go to office hours. The professor they have office hours and nobody comes and sees them during the office hours. So go visit with the professor, talk to them about what's going on, what's difficult. I think it's important to start this conversation. And I think about this with high school teachers too. Start the communication and the relationship on a positive note, because then if something goes wrong and you need to address it, then you have the foundation of a positive relationship. So I think it's important to send an email to professors. It's not required. But if the college doesn't have a system, which probably most of them do by now, where they send the accommodations to the professors, then the students will have to do that. And before, technology got so advanced, that was when I first started doing this work, that was the procedure, where the students had to hand the professor a letter or email them that had their accommodations with it. If the student is going to get like small group testing or any kind of testing accommodations, there's a separate center at the colleges that are the testing center. And so if that is the case, then they'll have to communicate with their professor, and they'll have to communicate with the testing center. And so you could see that that could get complicated. And I think for Augie's sake, he chose not to take the extra time because he didn't want to have to deal with having to make 2 appointments, and that just felt too complicated. So that's his choice. He gets to choose that. And so if they have a testing center accommodations, then they wouldn't take tests like with their class. They would take tests at the testing center. And so they would just communicate with the testing center and the professor, and then the professor would give the test to the testing center, and then they would administer the test and then give it back to the professor. Those disability services counselors are there to help. And having a relationship. I mean, you hear I keep saying the word relationship because I think relationships are crucial. Relationships with teachers, relationships with administrators, and this is no different than high school. I feel like it's really important in middle school, high school, all of school. If you have relationships with your teachers, what I find is they'll bend over backwards to help you, but you got to communicate with them. And okay. So that's kind of requesting and receiving accommodations in college. I do want to point out that a college can deny your request. And the way that typically works is basically if you make a reasonable request for an accommodation, they can only deny it if they can say this, but it's really not legal. I mean, they can say, well, we just don't offer that. Well, what they're saying is if they deny a request, it has to fundamentally alter an essential requirement of the program, or it has to place an undue burden on the school. And so if someone says, well, we just don't offer that, I would ask for that in writing, and I would ask for clarification of what that means. Like, you've made the request and they're denying the request, and I would ask for the grounds on why they're denying that request. And because a lot of times the requests aren't, like if you were having a class where you were building engines, and you asked to not have to build the engine because you have anxiety and that would really stress you out. That's probably, that would fundamentally alter the essential requirements of that program, because that program is all about building that engine, right? But so that would probably not be a reasonable request. But if you requested to do it in small group, or to do it at a time that's a different time than everybody else is doing it, that probably would be a reasonable request, because it doesn't fundamentally alter what they're trying to teach. I hope that makes sense. And then the undue burden, if you're asking the school to spend a whole lot of money, and maybe it's a small private school with only a couple hundred kids that's in rural Georgia, and that they could say, we're denying this request because it places an undue burden on us. And so if it does happen and they deny your request, then there are grievance procedures that you can find on the website. And actually, when Augie took a dual enrollment class, we ended up filing a grievance with the college. And if your kid has the opportunity to take dual enrollment, I encourage it, because it really does give them, while they're in high school, kind of a glimpse of what college is like. And they can request accommodations. They can go through that whole process while they're still living at home with you, and you can support them through that process. And so Augie, because of his chronic fatigue and his chronic Lyme disease, there are times that he just crashes. He gets flared up and he just completely crashes. And so he needs extra time to complete assignments. And so that was one of his requests. And they said, yeah, they do that in high school. We don't do that in college. But they couldn't really tell us why they didn't do that in college. And so Augie and I together, we asked for the reason in writing. They provided the reason in writing. We looked at the grievance procedures, and it's like appealing. We appealed and we took it up a level and said, but this is the, no, maybe it was the attendance requirement. I don't remember what the requirement was, but anyway, but we took it up a level, and then they replied to that, and then we still didn't like the answer. So we took it up another level. We ended up talking to the dean of the school or something like that. And we ended up getting the accommodation. And it was just that they hadn't done that before. And maybe they didn't have a lot of kids with chronic illnesses who needed that accommodation. And so I encourage you to just because they say no, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not willing to do it. Maybe they've never done that before. And so you have to just kind of follow the procedures. It was a great experience for Augie because it wasn't ugly. It was, we're gonna fight for this accommodation. If we don't get it, we don't get it. But it was important for him. Okay, so another question. It is the student's responsibility to make sure professors know about his or her accommodations. Yes. It's not the parents. The parents can't call the professors. The school doesn't want to talk to you. Sorry. Okay, so this is helpful for me. This is the way I think about it. I'm going to share it with you. We have 4 phases of kind of parenting as our children are on a journey to become as independent as they can become. In the first phase, we as parents, we do everything for our kids. When they're little bitty, they're helpless. They can't do anything. We have to do everything, right? And then as they get a little older, we do it. Let's take homework, for example. Well, we don't ever do it. Hopefully we don't do the homework for the kids. At first, they don't have any homework. And but then we do it with our kids, okay? For homework, we sit with them. We're leading the process, but they're participating in the process. And then there's a shift that happens, and the kids are doing it with their parent. Homework is not a good example. Throw that one out. It's not a good example. The kids are doing it with their parents. And then the 4th phase is the kids are doing it independently. Okay, I got another example. When kids are in elementary school, early elementary school, parents are emailing the teachers. This is a problem. Somebody had a bad day. He didn't get any sleep. He spent all weekend at his dad's, whatever. We're emailing the teachers for our children, right? Because we are their advocate. And then at some point, there's a shift, and we're doing that with our kids, okay? We're sitting with them. Hey, let's email your teacher together. I'm still typing, but we're doing that together. For my kids, that was probably third or fourth grade, maybe. And then by the end of elementary school, my kids were emailing their teachers, but with my help. Like they would say, Mom, I need to email Miss Todd. I don't know what to say. Let's sit down and read them. So Augie's driving, he's doing the typing, but I'm right there with him. Okay. And we spend a lot of time at phase 3. And then the fourth phase is Augie's emailing his teachers independently. If he needs help, he'll ask me and I'll help him. And I think of it, I put this little visual really to remind me on the bottom right, to remind me to tell you how I think about this. Is I think about it, if you ever ran track or you've watched track, you know that there's a baton. And our goal in this whole parenting journey that we're on is to pass the baton to our children, right? We want to pass the baton to the children. We want them to take that baton and we want them to run away with it to the best of their abilities, right? So at first we're holding the baton as a parent. That's phase 1. Then we're handing it to our kid and the kid grabs a hold and we're holding that baton together. And then the phase 3, we're still holding it together, but the kid's taking a little more control of it. And then phase 4 is parents let go and the kid is holding the baton. Now, what I find in my parenting journey is that we are in and out of phases 3 and 4. My kids are 17 and 20. And so we're in and out of 3 and 4 on these. And there are times, sometimes, we have to even go all the way back to 1. If Augie's having a very huge flare up, he doesn't have the energy to do his laundry. His mama's going to do his laundry for him. We're going to just go right back to 1. I'm going to do his laundry. I'm going to make him a turkey burger, and that's okay, you know. And so I think there's a lot of on the parenting kind of Facebook groups and some of that. Like most colleges will have a Facebook group for parents. There's a lot of talking about allowing your children to be adults and be independent and make mistakes. And I totally believe that. I think we need to let them make choices, live with their choices. But I think when you have children with disabilities, it is a little different. And we also have to, they don't magically grow up just because they went to college. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed yet. And so they've got some work to do. And so I think it's important to hold on together. And people ask me sometimes, what's the difference between enabling and supporting? Because I want to support my kids. I don't want to enable them, right? And it's a personal, it's hard. It's hard to know sometimes. But for me, as long as my kids are making progress, then I feel like I'm supporting them and not necessarily enabling them. But it's tricky. But I think the visual of the baton for me is helpful because I find if I'm holding it too much, then maybe I'm not challenging my kids enough to hold the baton and to take it, you know. But I think holding it together is important to do. Like your kids just may not be confident enough to send the emails to the Disability Services Office and do some of that. And so maybe you have to do that with them at first, and then they'll become more confident. But I encourage you to not log into their email and do it for them and pretend to be them. I encourage you, because I know some parents do that. I encourage you to do it with them, not for them, because they need to learn how to do it. They need to learn the skills. Okay, so that's my soapbox on that. Okay, so how do we prepare the students to advocate for themselves? I think it's important that they know themselves. What are their strengths and what are their challenges? I think it is just as important to know what their strengths are as it is to know what their challenges are. And, you know, I've done this exercise in a couple of parenting classes, and it's very interesting because if we were in person, I might ask this question and make y'all a little uncomfortable, but I want you to think of 2 of your own strengths, 2 strengths that you have. I'm really good at whatever. Okay. And then later, if that's hard for you, then I encourage you to spend some time on it ask your best friend, ask your spouse, ask some people, because I think we all know what our challenges are, but sometimes we don't know what our strengths are. And the same is for our kids. It's important that they know what their strengths are. So I encourage you to ask your kids about what are their strengths? What are they really good at? What brings them joy? What's because you want to develop those things. You don't want to spend all your time just focused on the challenges. But they need to know what the challenges are. And in my mind, they need to know the word disability, because that's part of accessing those rights means they have to use that word. And there's a lot of articles. If you just Google like how to talk to your kids about their disability, there's some articles out there that can be helpful. You can talk to other parents and parent groups. I think the earlier the better, because we can neutralize the word disability is the language I use, because, you know, having a disability is just part of who I am. It doesn't define me. It doesn't define my children. It's just one part. It's just a thing. It's not a good word. It's not a bad word. It's just a neutral word. Sometimes it can be frustrating, sure. But knowing what the challenges are and being able to explain how does the disability impact the education, that's really important. That's something that you can practice. You could practice talking to your IEP team about that. You could practice talking to a Sunday school teacher at church. You could practice on anybody that'll listen, the bus driver or whoever, because that's important. Grandma, maybe. Okay, and then another thing is knowing what your rights are. It's important that kids know what their rights are, to be able to navigate the rights. And then knowing how to get what you need is kind of how to be assertive without being aggressive, because it's not necessary to be angry or ugly or anything like that. It's a process, and the more you learn to navigate it, the more successful you're going to be. And the bottom line is relationships are the key to success in most fields. And so it doesn't really matter how smart you are. A lot of times what matters is how you can navigate relationships. And so even really the really gifted kids sometimes struggle when they get into college and they get into the workplace, because, I mean, you know, how long are you going to keep a job if you're going to throw a huge temper tantrum because somebody's sitting in your chair in the break room? I mean, learning how to navigate those relationships, it's really worth spending the time on while they're still living with you. Okay. So these are some kind of ideas on having your kids attend their meetings, have them prepare for the meetings, preparing like a one-pager on this is what's going well, this is what's challenging, this is what I need to be successful, and encourage them to have some of the tough conversations. And they're not going to always get it right. They're gonna mess it up sometimes. Just like when you're learning any skill, you're going to mess it up. And so I think sometimes instead of focusing on maybe how they messed it up, focus on, boy, that was really brave. The fact that you talked to your teacher about a hard time that you were having with the way that she talked to you, that was really brave that you did that. But let's talk about maybe how to do that better next time. Or let's talk about, you know, you can have the criticism, but try to couch it with, you know, because it is brave. It is brave to speak up. Already talked about that. Explaining why you need accommodations. Like you could start this in high school. You could really start practicing. We put in with Augie's permission, of course, in his 504 plan that he had to ask for some of his accommodations in high school, because I wanted him to get used to, if you want the accommodation, you got to ask for it. And so if he didn't ask for it, he didn't get it. And that'd be something to consider. Okay, emailing the teachers, counselors, administrators, asking for help. I've kind of talked about all those things. Okay, practicing at home, in the community. This can start early, or learning your rights. Already talked about that. Taking a dual enrollment class. I think it can be really helpful. And it's going to depend on the kid, of course, but it may be, you know, and teaching them how to resolve conflicts with and without support. That's going to be important too. Okay, so students in high school can request college accommodations when they take dual enrollment classes. Yes, they can. Now, does it happen automatically? No, it doesn't happen, even though if you know that they're still in high school, but when they take a dual enrollment class, they're in high school and they're in college. So that request for accommodations has got to be made at the college. It doesn't matter what they've got in high school, because they're a college student. Okay, another question. High school students who know their accommodations and advocate for them are more successful in college. True. Yes. They need to know what their accommodations are, and they need to know how to advocate for them. Okay, so I've got time for a few questions. And I think I've got Beverly on. Beverly, do you want to unmute and ask me a couple of the questions from the chat box?
Sure, I'll be glad to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the first one is says who can assist with obtaining accommodations for acuplacer testing?
Yeah, I would think that would be through the school system. I mean, ask the school counselor. I would think the school counselor could do that, or the case manager could probably help with that too. I'm not as familiar with acuplacer. I'm not 100% if that, I think it's through the school system or if it's through a college, but I would totally ask. The school counselors know about this stuff, so I would ask them.
All right, the next one, do the same accommodations apply to technical colleges?
Yes. Oh, I should have said that at the very beginning. That's a great question. When I say college, I really use that as a broad term. It could really be any further education, because it could be technical college, it could be a 2-year college, it could be a 4-year college. The goals, remember we talked about the IDEA, which is the law that governs special education. The 3 goals of the IDEA are to prepare students with disabilities for further education, employment, and independent living. So yeah, it would be any kind of, when I say college, I mean I'm taking a broad loop. I'm glad you asked that question, because I had that in my notes, but I have a tendency not to look at my notes. All right, give me another one, Beverly.
Okay, it says if we got reevaluated this year and she is a high school sophomore, should she be good to go?
Well, she's in 10th grade, so I'm not sure. I think it would depend on the college and how recent they want the documentation. For some colleges, she would be perfectly fine. And for others, they may want something more recent. So it kind of just depends on where she's thinking about going to school.
So is that just me calling, because we're at a private school, so
Mhm.
is that just maybe her senior year, just touching base with the special ed program in Coweta County, see what they think?
I would tell you, it depends on where she wants to go to school. Like if you
Okay.
know the documentation requirements say within 3 years, I think a sophomore, junior, that's cutting it close, because that is 3 years, you know. So I would touch base at the beginning of her senior year.
Okay.
Because you know those evaluations, they take a while.
Yeah. We just went through it. It was a great, just so y'all know, for those of you who haven't, the Coweta, y'all are amazing. Georgia, your team is amazing. So it was not very painful at all, just filling out a bunch of paperwork.
Good. Yeah, no, I agree that Coweta is amazing. I really do. And Beverly, you can tell Chrissy that she said it was my team. I kind of like that. I kind of like that, especially since I don't even work for Coweta anymore. But I do consider it to be my team for sure.
Right. We still consider you to be our team too.
Well, good. I'm glad. Thank you. All right, give me another question.
Okay. Does the student need to submit a record of their disability to the university or college? If there is a record letter needed, will this be one from the high school or one that comes from a medical office?
It depends on what the disability is. So like Augie was requesting accommodations because of his chronic Lyme disease. And so because that is a medical condition, and that's why he needed the accommodations, he needed a letter from a medical doctor and didn't need the updated psychological report. But if he were requesting, he didn't need accommodations for his autism, because he just made so much progress. So if he were requesting accommodations for, like if my daughter who has dyslexia and ADHD was requesting accommodations, they would want to see the psychological report. And so in that case, it would be fine to be coming from the psychological, the psych program, the psychological that they do, and not necessarily a doctor. But it's really going to depend on the school. I'm hearing, especially now that I got a kid that's a freshman in college, I'm hearing a ton of really, not everybody's doing it the same way. There's a lot of variability. So it depends on the school on what they require. Sorry, that wasn't very helpful, but that's the reality.
That looks like the last question.
Okay. Do I have any more? We got 4 minutes. Wow. I rarely end early. But we can end early if we need to. If there are any other questions, you're welcome to ask them, or you can email me.
I'm still wading through. I think I have figured out the process of getting the ACT and SAT. From my understanding with the SAT, I can go through this. I've gotten the paperwork and filled out all that. They have it in their hands.
Right.
The SAT, I have to go through my school, and the school actually makes the appointment. I tell them what date I want to do. With the ACT, it looks like I have to go to ACT. Does that sound correct?
That does.
Okay.
They're two different companies. I think they're two completely different companies. So you have to request them differently. But that does sound correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a process for sure. So all right. So I guess I will wrap up, and I'm gonna stop the recording. I appreciate you guys coming. I'll send kind of a follow-up email that will have the recording for the people that